In this video, I'm going to go over what 100% sourdough starter is, how you make it, what the 100% means, what kind of impact it has on fermentation and on the bread, and also, most importantly, how it affects flavor in your final product. Hi, I'm Jenny Pryor from Living by Baker, and I love to help sourdough bakers kind of weed through all the information that's online and different sources and really understand how sourdough works, how to make sourdough so that you can just do this all your life and have a lot of joy in it and no confusion. So let's talk about sourdough starters. So here I have a active 100% hydration sourdough starter. And then another common type of sourdough starter that you might hear about or see is a stiff sourdough starter. So first, let me talk about the 100% hydration sourdough starter. This type of starter is extremely common for new sourdough bakers. This is usually what's used in many online recipes. It might be called a regular starter. Some people even call it a liquid starter. So first, what does 100% mean? In baking, we use baker's percentages to be really precise because it helps us understand how the dough is going to ferment, because each percentage, whether it's a fat percentage in the dough or a hydration percentage, talk about the amount of liquid, is going to tell us more about how the dough is going to turn out, how it's going to ferment, and also how it's going to bake. So when I say 100% hydration, that number refers to the amount of water in proportion to the flour. So 100% means if it's going to be equal weight of water to flour. So in my recipe I use for making the starter for one basic loaf of sourdough bread, which is 100 grams used in the total recipe, I use 60 grams of water and 60 grams of white flour added to the tablespoon of starter. So the weights are in equal proportion to each other. And so once we divide, and the full calculation is in the attached blog post below, but the calculation is water divided by the total amount of flour, and that's going to give you a percentage, and then multiply that percentage by 100 to find your percentage without a decimal point. 100% hydration means that we're using equal weight of water to flour. And so what that does is that water, that really wet environment, you can see the movement in this starter. This gives all the microorganisms, the yeast and the lactic acid bacteria, lots of room to move, and also creates the most acid development. The two types of acids that build up in your sourdough starter are acetic acid and lactic acid. Both these types of acids build up and create more flavor and more texture, and these are what help break down the gluten to make it more digestible. And so this type of starter with all that liquid is going to produce more acids in general, but also creates a higher amount of lactic acid. And so all those acids together, the higher amount of acids created, create a more sour, tangy flavor. You also notice that this will ferment a lot faster. When you add this to your dough recipe, what you will notice is that your dough texture will be a little bit looser, a little more fluid. This adds a lot more hydration to the overall dough. And the rate at which it ferments is going to be slightly faster than using a stiffer starter. And in the end product, we're going to have more sour notes that come out in the final bread. But you can adjust this. But for those of you who love your sourdough bread to be really sour, this is the kind of starter you'll want to use. And you can use 100% hydration starter in sweet recipes. I use them for a lot just because it's so easy to mix up, and I regularly have this on hand. So in order to make a sweet recipe, I have a few recommendations in the full post, but what you're going to look for is your dough recipe should be a lower hydration overall when you add this. Also, sweeter ingredients will help to make your bread overall a little bit sweeter. And also, using cold fermentation, using your fridge will help to slow down the acid development and create more of the acetic acid, which tends to not taste as sour in the final bread. And now for those who love sourdough, I have lots of tips, but a few of them that I'm going to discuss here, the rest are in the blog post. A few of those tips are, you're going to use this type of starter. In your bread dough, you want your bread dough to have a little bit higher hydration overall. So especially for beginners, I recommend in a range of 65 to 75%. You can see in the blog post there's a calculator for calculating your percentage of hydration, which is really helpful if you're using a new recipe. You can plug those numbers in there. And you also want to use room temperature fermentation, especially the warmer the weather, the warmer your room, the more of those acids and that sour tang is going to build up. And you want to watch the fermentation window. I tell people if they want it to be really sour to let it go a little bit longer, usually 9 to 12 hours at room temperature. But you really want to watch your dough, because if you let it ferment too long, the gluten will be too broken down. You'll be left with a stringy dough, which we definitely don't want, because that's a real pain to try to shape, and it will not give you really good final results. If you're curious about bulk fermentation, what you're looking for, especially if you're going to push that window a little bit further to get more sour flavor development, check out this other video about bulk fermentation, what to look for. So this 100% hydration starter will make your bread a little more sour, and it's also super easy maintained. And because of the more liquid milkshake type consistency, I can usually refresh this type of starter in about 5 minutes. Now, you might want to know about different types of flour added to this. So there's a lot I could say about flour, but I'm going to keep it short in this video. First of all, the white type of flour is important if you want your fermentation to be homogeneous, which means it's always going to give you the same reliable results, same reliable timeline. So I recommend, if you want to try different flours in a starter, to make a separate starter with the whole wheat flour or the rye flour. And you should know that if you make a separate starter, so you have 2 jars here, one with your regular white starter, one with your whole wheat starter, that whole wheat flour and rye flour are going to ferment very differently. You're adding different enzymes in the flour. It's going to create heterogeneous fermentation, which means that there's going to be different development, different enzymes that create different timelines, different flavors, and different bacteria, which can be really good for developing more flavors in your bread. A lot of times I find that if you use whole wheat or rye flour to make a starter, that you will develop even more of those sour flavors. However, you will have to add a little bit more water, because 100% hydration works really well with white flour. When you're working with a rye flour or whole wheat flour, you have a thirstier flour, and a lot of times there's variability how much water it absorbs. So that is something that you'll have to play with, and that's why it's a more advanced method. And that's why I always recommend for beginners to stick with the white flour and to add the rye flour or whole wheat flour to your bread dough and leave this alone. Let's talk a little bit about the stiff starter. Now, a stiff starter is a really fun way to change up your bread dough. I recommend, again, keeping your regular white starter, that's the 100% hydration liquid one that most likely you have started your sourdough journey with, to make sure you protect this and only use a portion of this to create a stiff starter. So this stiff starter you see here, I took 30 grams of my established sourdough starter, put it in this new jar, and to the new jar I added 100 grams of flour and 50 to 60 grams of water. And it creates a very stiff dough. That's why this one takes a little bit longer to care for, because you have to really mix it. Sometimes you'll even have to knead it by hand to make sure all that flour gets absorbed by the water. There's no dry flour left over. But you see this texture is so different. This stiff starter stays in a jar. It looks more like a dough consistency. You can see it gets an aerated look on the outside, but it doesn't have this liquidy look. So see how different those starters are side by side. Now, I did a side-by-side experiment, if you're curious. That was really cool to see how 2 breads that were about the same recipe, made adjustments that are as similar as possible, the different results that they have between using a stiff starter and using the 100% hydration starter. Now, the stiff starter has a lot of advantages, and so this is one that is a really, really good starter to try out as you are getting more comfortable with this sourdough process. I really recommend that you don't try this until you get that sourdough starter consistency down, like once you have your feeding and care routine down and you are consistently having good results with your bread. Also, one good indicator of that you are doing well in your sourdough baking is that you should have at least one recipe, usually your main recipe, memorized, so you can just make that recipe and you know what it looks like almost without measuring it, but you see what it looks like, you know the process by heart without looking at the recipe. The advantages of using a stiff starter is your starter will maintain its activity for longer because there's more food for those microorganisms to eat. So that's really helpful if you don't know how the day is going to go. This will stay active in its active peak longer than the liquid starter, which will start to fall faster. Also, it creates more mild flavors in your bread. So if you're making donuts or sweet sourdough breads, this is the kind of starter that produces the most sweet, mild flavor. It also creates a really nice rise in your bread. The dough tends to have a more stiff and upright rise rather than having a more spreading rise that you get with this kind of fermentation with 100% hydration starter. This starter creates more of the acetic acid production, which is still acid, but it's less acids overall, and the composition is different because acetic is in higher proportion than the lactic acid. So to me, I find it tastes milder and more sweet, but it does have a different flavor and is really flavorful in the final bread. The disadvantages of a stiff starter is that they're not all the same across the board. People use different amounts of hydration for a stiff starter. So that's why the 100% is so much easier to use, and a lot of recipes use that online. So the hydration levels can vary from recipe to recipe for stiff starters. So you want to pay attention to that. That variability can be really tricky for new sourdough bakers, but this is a great way to change up your sourdough, to change up the flavor. Both produce great results and will create more fermented final product. And I'm going to show you how I create the stiff starter. And so you'll see the process isn't too difficult, but it takes a little more effort to get this complete mix together. So there you have it. Hopefully that was a good, short, clear overview of how these starters are different, what a 100% hydration starter is, how to use it, and what impact it has on your bread, and as well as a good intro to the stiff starter and what that looks like in your bread baking. And I hope this gets you excited to use your sourdough starter, helps you learn more about your existing sourdough starter that most likely you started with, and gives you a good intro, or maybe gets you the courage to try this one for some recipes. If you have questions, post those in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it. And I would love if you subscribe to my channel so I can share more sourdough content with you, more recipes, and more help like this. Well, I hope that you have a great day connecting with people through sourdough and bread. Bye.